The parish church of St. Peter has been at the centre of the life of Burnley for at least 850 years. In the early years of the 19th century, when this picture was engraved, the centre of the town was here in front of the church, where we see the stocks and the base of the market cross. By that time, the market and business area of Burnley were near their present position, as the population grew and the commercial centre moved away from the crossing of the Brun. We have no picture of the church earlier than this sketch, redrawn recently by Mrs. Lois Judson. It was taken from a photo of a lost picture which shows the building in about 1790. As the town grew in medieval times, the small building which had served the population of the area for nearly 400 years was too small and needed repair. So in 1532 the work was begun. There is some evidence that the tower had been rebuilt earlier, and it was decided to replace the roof and enlarge the side aisles. We don't know why the whole work was never finished, but only the nave and north aisle were completed then, leaving the south aisle narrow and low. It was not until 1789 that the south aisle was raised and a balcony put in, and this picture shows the raised south wall. The height of the tower was increased by 30 feet in 1802 to accommodate a new peal of 8 bells to replace the 4 bells which had been used since 1702. Until late in the 18th century, St. Peter's Church was the only church to minister to the growing town. Here baptisms, marriages and burials took place, and the population came to worship. The first Methodist chapel was built in 1787 on Keighley Green. From 1742 the massive pulpit, reading desk and clerk's pew made of Danzig oak dominated the front of the nave. It was described as a mountain of wood and remained there until 1856, and with the organ loft and choir balcony it filled the east end of the church. The rear balcony was added in 1737 as congregations grew, and in 1789 the south aisle was raised and widened so that a balcony could be made. When this engraving was made, there had been large additions to the church to match the growing importance and industrialization of Burnley. The north aisle had been raised to accommodate the gallery, and the tower was rebuilt to accommodate a new peal of 8 bells, which together weighed 7,300 hundredweights. These are still in use, though they have been rehung and repaired several times during the past 200 years. The old font, which was made in 1533, is shown in the centre aisle at the back of the church. Unfortunately, the font was shattered in the recent fire, but the few pieces which were left are on show under the tower by the west door. This font must have had very close connections with the Townley family, because their crest was shown on 2 sides, together with carvings of a pattern and flagon, a belled sheep or goat, similar to that shown on the Stansfield coat of arms, and on another side the hammer, nails and pincers. These may represent the instruments of the crucifixion, but similar carvings on the tower suggest that a local smith may have been an important contributor to the church at the time. It was in 1856 that the church was reopened after extensive alterations which gave the building its present interior form, with its clerestory and magnificent east window, which was paid for by public subscription in honour of the incumbent, Robert Moseley Master. This will be mentioned in detail later. In the 1856 alterations, the massive 3-decker pulpit was removed and the organ was placed above the gallery at the back of the church when the clerestory was raised. Most of the beams and panels of the roof were the original oak of 1533, which were reused, and even after the recent fire the main beams were saved, and only the rear panels of the roof are new wood. Before we look at the interior of the church in detail, there are many interesting features outside the building and in the churchyard. This picture, taken about 1900, shows the church blackened by the smoke of the hundreds of mill chimneys in the town, few of which are left now. The chancel had been extended in 1872 and a new vestry built with the organ installed above it. When the first Bishop of Burnley, Bishop Hoskins, was consecrated in 1901, a new vestry was built. This is the most recent addition to the exterior of the church. As we enter the churchyard, we come to the clergy vestry. On the wall of the vestry is the plaque commemorating the Queen's visit to the church in 1968. Just past the vestry, on the south wall of the church, is a sundial which was placed there in 1791 when the new gallery was installed. The inscription reads, "Constructed by Mr. Wyman of Gawthorpe in the year 1791. When we come to the tower, we see the door to the belfry. Above this door, on the south side of the tower, there are two fascinating details drawn here by John Lowe, which have caused a lot of discussion and interest for many years. One is a crude sculpture of an animal, which may be the goat shown on the arms of the Stansfield family, and on the same stone is the top of a framed circular shape. Below it, and fitted to it by the mason in the rebuilding, is what seems to be the same coat of arms as that on the old font, showing the hammer, tongues and horseshoes of the blacksmith. The same symbols appear on the blacksmith's tombstone in the churchyard. This old picture, dated about 1860, shows the graveyard soon after it was closed. The oldest gravestone is dated 1664. Many of the inscriptions tell the story of life in Burnley and its disasters, hardships, family tragedies and accidents, and there are many stories of virtuous lives. For about 700 years this was the only burial ground in Burnley, so nearly 30 generations of Burnley families have been laid to rest here, probably numbering more than 100,000 of our forebears. As we enter the church through the porch, we see in the southwest corner the bust of Canon Robert Townley Parker, who was the incumbent from 1855 to 1901, when great changes were made in the church. His family had the right to appoint the clergy, and the living was one of the richest in the land. In 1890, with great generosity, he surrendered nearly all the endowments to the ecclesiastical commissioners. In return, they agreed, in the Burnley Rectory Act, to allocate the income between St. Peter's and the 9 daughter parishes in the town. By the same act, all future rectors of St. Peter's would be suffragan bishops of Burnley. Next we pass the East Lancashire Regiment's Boer War Memorial. In the last century the regiment was based in Burnley, and until recent years St. Peter's was their home church. As we walk round, we find their colours and several of their memorials in the church. The base of the tower and the lower walls are probably the oldest part of the church, dating from before the 15th century. Before the fire of 1991, this area housed the font with its carved oak cover. This baptistery had been panelled and the font had been moved here as part of the memorial to Canon Townley Parker, who was mentioned earlier. The window above the west door shows the flames rising from the church, which is surviving the fire and carrying on its work for the future of the town and its people. The remarkable work of restoration can be imagined from these pictures caught on video after the fire. In 1988, the church had been closed after an architect had reported that the building was in a dangerous condition. Many people, both church members and many well-wishers in the town, had worked to finance the rebuilding, helped by a grant from English Heritage. Early in the morning of the 14th of September 1991, within weeks of the reopening, the fire devastated the West End and damaged the organ and furnishings. Finally, after more effort by many people, on the 29th of November 1992, the church was finally reopened. In 1977 there had been a small fire in the northwest corner of the church which damaged the old vestry and the room above, which has been known by many generations as New Zealand. After the fire, a meeting room had been made with a small kitchen. More recently, this part of the church was redesigned with adequate toilet and kitchen accommodation so that the church can be used in future for a wide range of activities in the community. Looking towards the altar before we continue our tour of the building, we see the chairs which replaced the old wooden pews so that the nave can accommodate the congregation and the seating can be moved to suit whatever arrangement is required. This picture was taken in 1957 by Roger Hargreaves before the balcony was removed above the north aisle, and shows one of the many changes which have been made to the church over recent years. Moving towards the north aisle, we pass the cupboard which houses the equipment belonging to the Church Lads Brigade, which is not functioning at present. The parish banner is in the large cupboard. This board shows the names of all the clergy mentioned in the records, but some may have been chantry priests and others may have been attached to the private chapel at Townley Hall. For many centuries, the legal procedures involved in creating a new parish were very complex, so Burnley remained officially a chapelry of Whalley until 1867. John Foldy's name is shown beside the date 1520. He is associated with the Foldy's Cross, now in Townley Park, but it was originally erected in 1520 and placed in the churchyard. It was partially destroyed by vandals in 1789 and was rescued by Charles Townley, repaired and placed behind Townley Hall. It was removed to its present position at the top of the Lime Avenue in Townley Park in 1911. The list shows the 7 rector bishops. The combined function of bishop and rector proved to be very onerous, and in 1977 the position of rector was separated from the office of bishop. The lower windows in the north aisle are filled with stained glass of the 19th century in memory of local families. Above them, the first of the windows shows the shields of the 4 schools closely associated with the church: St. Peter's School, the Grammar School, the Girls' High School and Townley School. The next window has the badges of the Society of St. George and the Sir Optimist Club, which have close associations with St. Peter's Church. The third window shows the coats of arms of the 4 dioceses which have included Burnley during the church's history: Lichfield, founded in 626, Chester from 1541, Manchester from 1848 and Blackburn from 1926. This wall tablet records the bequest of Elizabeth Peel of Bridgend, who died in 1800 and who left a bequest for the poor of Burnley, which still brings an annual income for distribution by the church. Before we enter the Townley Chapel, we pass the Great War Memorial tablet with the names of the men of the parish who died in the 1914-18 war. The Spencer Memorial screen at the entrance to the Townley Chapel bears the crests of the Townley family, the province of York and the diocese of Blackburn. The Townley chantry was one of the 4 chantries of St. Peter's Church. In the Middle Ages it was the custom for wealthy Christians to endow a chantry which provided an income to be paid to a secular priest, who said Mass at a certain altar for the souls of the founder and members of his family. There were 4 chantries in St. Peter's Church. The Townley chantry was founded in 1373 by Thomas de Lally, a forebear of the Townley family, and it was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The chantry priest had a house and garden between the river and the northwest corner of the church. The Stansfield chantry, dedicated to St. Anthony, was probably founded during the 14th century. The other 2 chantries were associated with the rood screen and the high altar. The rood screen must have been removed in later alterations to the church, certainly before 1740. The chantries were all suppressed after the Reformation and their lands and income confiscated. The Townley Chapel was refurnished as part of the memorial to those who died in the 1914-18 war. At that time, the fine oak altar and panelling were added, and Baron O'Hagan gave the altar rails from the chapel at Townley Hall. On the south side of the altar is the 1939-45 War Memorial tablet, and the theme of the armed forces is continued in the embroidery of the kneelers in the chapel, which were made by the St. Peter's Church needleworkers. On each side of the altar are the shields which were found immediately below the surface when the vaults were opened in 1847 for the reception of the remains of Peregrine Edward Townley and his widow. Surmounting the Townley coat of arms is the Sparrow Hawk, which gave its name to the oldest inn of the town, and whose successor still stands across the road from the church. This chapel is always reserved for private prayer and devotion. Even in the days of severest repression, the Townley family were loyal Roman Catholics and maintained their faith as they still do. Some of the distinguished members of the Townley family are commemorated in the wall tablets in the chapel and on the tombs. One of the memorials is to Richard Townley, whose father was killed at Marston Moor while fighting for the Royalist cause. His body was never found, and the story is told of his widow searching the battlefield for his body. Cromwell himself met her and advised her to give up her quest and return home. Another distinguished member of the family commemorated here is Charles Townley, the antiquarian, who died in 1805 and who is shown on the famous painting by Zoffany, which is in Townley Hall. On the table beside this tablet is the case holding the parish memorial book. In the corner by the altar is the most recent memorial in the Townley Chapel. It is in memory of Francis Townley, who was executed for his part in the Jacobite rebellion of 1745. His family recovered his head and kept it for many years in the chapel at Townley Hall. 200 years later, in 1947, his descendant, Lord O'Hagan, with Bishop Swain and Gerald Lever, the verger, attended a private service in the Townley Chapel, when the head of Francis Townley was placed finally with his ancestors in the tomb on the south side of the chapel. The story was told by the verger that the head was delivered in a square box by the postman to his home on Shorey Bank a few days before the ceremony. The chair in the Townley Chapel is on loan from the local authority and is the old mayoral chair from the council chamber in the days before 1974, when Burnley was a county borough. It is used as the bishop's chair at confirmations and replaces a valuable old chair which was stolen. The family tree of the Townley family can be seen on the screen beside the chair. If we glance to the back of the church as we enter the chancel, we can imagine the church before it was enlarged. The tower, we believe, has remained in its present position since the stone church was built, but the rest of the building has been extended on all three sides as Burnley has grown. If we inspect the wall of the tower closely, we can find the old roof lines from the medieval church and the time before the 1856 alterations. The east window is also known as the master window because it was bought by public subscription in 1856 to commemorate the ministry of Robert Moseley Master, who served the church and the town from 1826 until 1855. He was known as the clogging parson because of his frequent gifts of clogs to children he met in the street who were barefooted and starving at that time of hardship in the town. The window depicts incidents in the life of our Lord and works of mercy. The brass lectern was provided by the women of the congregation as their memorial to General Scarlett in 1872. The present wooden pulpit replaced the stone one which was given to Fulridge Church in 1903. On the left of the altar is the bishop's stall beside the memorial tablet to the second Bishop of Burnley, the Right Reverend Alfred Pearson. The richly painted reredos dates from 1856 and shows scenes from the Old Testament. It merits close inspection and is a worthy focal point for the church. On the south side of the sanctuary, below the organ loft, are three sedilia and a credence. The organ was placed in its present position in 1872 when the vestry below was built in memory of General Scarlett. At the same time, the sanctuary was extended by 12 feet as part of the memorial. We move from the sanctuary into the Stansfield Chapel, passing the fine oval memorial plaque which is in memory of the wife of Canon Robert Townley Parker, whose own memorial we have seen near the church entrance. On the right of the vestry door is the bust of General Scarlett, who was one of Burnley's most famous citizens. He was the hero of Balaclava in the Crimean War and led the charge of the Heavy Brigade. After his marriage to Charlotte Hargreaves, daughter of the Burnley mine owner Colonel Hargreaves of Ormerod House, he lived at Bank Hall. On the wall of the chapel are other interesting memorials, including the oldest article in the church, the gravestone which is reputed to have covered the coffin of Oliver de Stansfield, who died about 1340. On the stone are engraved a cross, fleury and sword, indicating that he was a priest and also soldier and constable of Pontefract Castle. Beside the stone is the plaque in memory of W.A.C. Cruikshank, famous as a composer of church music, who was the organist and choirmaster of St. Peter's from 1880 until he died in 1934. The oak bookcase commemorates the men who lost their lives in the Hapton Valley colliery disaster of 1962. When the old 16th century font was destroyed in the fire, after a long search the present font was found in a redundant church in Lincolnshire and placed in its present position in the Stansfield Chapel. On the north side of the chapel is the cabinet storing the altar frontals. On the screen at the entrance to the chapel is a shield bearing the coat of arms of the Stansfield family, who are associated with Hessenford and Worsthorne. The coat of arms has 3 belled goats, which are very similar to the animal carved on the old font and possibly also on the unexplained stone on the outside of the tower. These carvings may indicate that the Stansfield family were prominent subscribers to the church at the time. Returning to the south door, we pass several interesting memorial tablets and windows dating from the 19th century. So we complete our tour of the church, which has served Burnley for at least 900 years and will continue to serve the town in many different ways, in addition to being at the centre of the spiritual life of the community.